Is it good for me to go now? Hi, I'm Kaz Mitchell, and I'm one of the lecturers here at ACAP, and I'm here to talk about rewiring the brain and specifically as well in the ways in which counselling can help to rewire the brain. But of course, we don't need to go to see a counsellor to rewire the brain. We can do it in all kinds of ways. Before we get started, though, I'd just like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which the Melbourne campus stands. That's where I am today in Melbourne. And I'd also like to pay respect to the Wurundjeri elders past and present, and extend this respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait people from other communities who are here today. So let's get started. So first of all, let's just have a look at what we mean by neurons and neural networks, and also just a little bit about, you know, what is counselling? What are we doing when we're counselling people? I've come to think of it, particularly after looking at neuroscience and looking at the way that the brain operates, that there are three main categories that we're kind of helping our clients with. One is affect regulation, which is the ability to be able to soothe our own nervous system and to calm down our distress and when we're overwhelmed. So that's one. The other is to increase our moment-to-moment awareness, you know, just mindfulness, being mindfully present to what's happening in the moment. And the third one, which we're going to look at today, is stimulating what's called neural plasticity. So what do we mean by that? What is neural plasticity? Well, look, let's just first of all just think about what neurons are and what they do. Some of you may have come across the term neurons that fire together, wire together. Well, we have billions of neurons in our brain, and when they fire together, they connect up into neural networks, and particularly if it's something that we repeat, something that we do over and over again, then we start to create what are called these neural networks, which are almost, if you can think of them as like a groove that we'll get into, and we can often get stuck in a groove where we're doing the same kind of repetitive behaviors or the same way of thinking about something over and over again. We start to ruminate over things. That's like a neural network that has been well established and we just almost go to automatically. So what these neurons do, that they receive, evaluate, and transmit information that's coming at us all the time from all angles, some of it internal, you know, just what's happening in the body, and, you know, a signal to say that you're hungry, for instance, and it's time to eat. But also things that are coming at us in the environment. So what's happening around you right now, your brain is sensing, your nervous system is sensing and taking in all this information, and the neurons will evaluate this information and make a decision around what you should be doing right now. So if there was the smell of smoke suddenly in the room, for instance, a better example, for those of you here in Melbourne, you'll know what I'm talking about. Last week we had an earthquake, and the signals to the brain are going, something's wrong here, and the neurons are gathering this information. Different parts of the brain are all working together to figure out, maybe you should get out of the building, which is, by the way, what I did, because the walls were shaking, which is not normal. So these neurons then form networks with other neurons through experience. And this is good because this helps us to learn and repeat everyday tasks. So basically it means that every time you get up in the morning, you don't have to sort of scratch your head and go, okay, where do I keep my shoes, or how do I put the kettle on, and, you know, how does the toaster work again? So the more we repeat something, the more the behavior becomes automatic. Another thing that's really interesting to understand is the differences between the right side of our brain and the left side. So the right side of the brain experiences the world very differently to the left side. So the right side of our brain feels the world. Our felt sense comes from the right side of the brain, whereas the left side of our brain interprets what the feelings are and what's happening. The left side of the brain is the center of our language skills, and we're able to label things and try to make sense of what's happening. So the left side of the brain you could think of as being the interpreter, and it seeks explanations for what's happening internally and externally. Oh, my tummy's rumbling. Oh, I must be hungry. Oh, I'll better go to the fridge and see if there's anything I can eat. Or external events. Oh, the walls are shaking. I'm going to get out because I'm a bit scared that the building's going to fall down. So that's the interpreter. So the right brain feels it, and the left part of the brain interprets it. And so the left brain is it's searching for causes and effects. So, okay, my belly's rumbling because I'm hungry. Cause, effect. And it tries to order, it tries to create order from what can be chaos. If there's too many things happening all at once, it's trying to order things and make a bit of a list around what's important and what I need to do. And the thing about the left side of the brain, it just takes the information at hand, and then it makes up a story that makes sense. And facts are really useful to the left side of the brain, but the left side of the brain doesn't necessarily think about what's factual and what's fiction, and that we'll get to that in a second around how that can be problematic. But it essentially just takes information and it tries to make sense of the world around us. So in essence, what then we end up seeing is that our brain is trying to predict what's going to happen next. And of course, it can only really do that based on our past experiences. So I have never experienced, for instance, an earthquake before, certainly not one to the magnitude that we had the other day. So my brain was really scrambling, like, what on earth is going on? Because it had never experienced one before. Whereas I'm sure the next time it happens, I'd probably be a little bit calmer and I'd know what to do. I'd know, like, for instance, last week I ran out of the building, and I've since learned that that's the worst thing to do in an earthquake. It's better to hide under a table. So now I've got that information. Now I can make a prediction that's more realistic and probably safer. So the other thing about the brain is the brain is a social organ that adapts to its surroundings, and particularly to the people around us. So our interpersonal relationships with other people is one of the things that we're always trying to predict, how people are going to react in certain situations. And during the first 2 years of life, we rely on what's called our attachment circuitry, which is very much dominated by the right side of our brain, the right side of the brain that feels, that senses things. And the reason for that is because up until round about 2.5, we don't really have very much of a left brain. It's not very mature, but the right side is. The right side, we're pretty much born with the right side kind of fully matured and able to sense things, but unable to name them, unable to make sense of things, because we haven't got that interpreter, that part of the brain that can make sense of things. And it actually it takes us up until early adulthood before that left side of the brain is fully mature. So that means that in those first 2 years of our life, we're very dependent upon our caretakers. And that's also partly because our bodies aren't strong enough to look after ourselves. We can't feed ourselves. We can't do things for ourselves. But it's also we can't make sense of things. And what happens is that we really need our primary caretakers to regulate our fears and anxieties when we're babies and toddlers. And that stays with us right the way through life. We learn at a very young age that other people can help us regulate, if we find the right people in life, that is. And so those early 2 years and beyond really shape the way that our brains form, and the neural networks that are formed are shaped at a very young age. And it's what leads us to have either a secure attachment or an insecure attachment. Some of you who might have studied a little bit of attachment theory will know what I'm talking about there. But essentially, these early relational experiences, they help us to predict what's going to happen next in terms of how other people are going to react to us. So if you grew up in a fairly stable environment where your caretakers were able to regulate your fears and anxieties and do it pretty promptly, you know, they'd come in, they'd soothe you and they'd rock you, you'd learn how to do that for yourself eventually. But for those who are not fortunate enough to have grown up in those kind of environments, and maybe they were left too long in their distress and they didn't learn how to regulate, they can really struggle and also struggle to know how to relate to other people, because they might not be as trusting of others as someone who grew up in an environment that felt safe all of the time or most of the time. So this starts to develop the kind of expectations that we'll have of the world. So if you expect bad things to happen all of the time, especially in relationships, that can foster a defensive attitude that actually ends up making people more likely to have difficult relationships. So it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're expecting people to treat you badly, then you might act in ways, you might be quite cold with people or a bit aloof or a bit angry and have all kinds of defensive mechanisms to keep people at a distance. And of course, and you end up experiencing the very thing that you're trying to avoid. So in therapy, in counselling, one of the top things that we always talk about is the therapeutic relationship and how healing it can be. And this is part of the reason, because it's actually helping people to learn to re-trust, or maybe to trust for the first time, that, you know, it can be safe to go and talk to someone, to open up and make yourself a little bit vulnerable, that not everyone is going to turn you away or reject you. And you start to learn that actually there's something happening here that feels really nice. This is very soothing. And then hopefully that encourages people to open up to other people in their lives that they feel safe with. And the other thing that therapy does is it stimulates neuroplasticity. And it does this in part through the relationship, through the learning that, oh, it's okay to talk about my feelings, as I've just said. So this creates these new neural networks that helps you feel safe. And it roots out our old maladaptive ways of thinking and responding to situations. And it plants new seeds that foster skills for self-regulation and better interpersonal relationships. And we're going to go into talking about that in a little bit more detail now. So rewiring the brain. So how do we do this? So, okay, so basically repetition strengthens a network. Anything that you do over and over and over again creates a new neural network, these neurons firing together. So the more you practice a new skill, the more your brain changes until it becomes automatic. So those of you who are musicians out there will understand this. So, you know, when you start to play, it probably sounds awful. And you probably feel really embarrassed about other people hearing it because it's all screechy and, you know, out of tune. Your fingers don't move quickly enough to make the chord shapes or to find the notes on your instrument. And it feels really, really hard. And a lot of people give up too soon because they've not understood how long it takes to actually learn to master a musical instrument. But after time, once you've been doing this over and over again, it gets to the point where you can just pick up a guitar automatically and someone will call out the chords and your fingers know exactly the shapes to make. You know exactly what to do. You don't even have to think about it. And that's the same for everything in life that we've learned and we've repeated over and over again. And so to move, and of course, it's where we form habits, and some of our habits are not always to our advantage, but they're hard to give up because these neural networks are so strong. So in order to rewire the brain, one of the first things that we have to do is to get outside of our comfort zone. We don't learn new things in our comfort zone. And this means at times safely exposing yourself to something that does make you feel uncomfortable. And then learning that, okay, this is all right, you know, I can do this. So, and this is the way that exposure therapy works, because it updates the data for our predictive brain to make better decisions, providing, of course, that you try something that is likely to have a good outcome. So, for instance, if you're fearful of heights, don't go bungee jumping until you've made sure that you're really secure to all of the bits that you need to be secure to. And this is not just about behaviors. So the repetition, we have networks of thoughts and stories that we tell ourselves. And if we just repeat the same sad story over and over again, it just strengthens the sad neural network. And it becomes even harder to get out of the more that we do this. So the goal is to facilitate positive change by constructing a solution to the problem, for instance, creating new thoughts, new stories, new behavioral patterns, and all of these lead to changes in emotions, to how we feel. A lot of the time we construct our own emotions through the stories and the patterns of behavior that we're engaged in, often unconsciously. We don't even recognize that we're doing these things because it's become so automatic. We can become a little bit like a stuck record. For those of you who, I'm a great lover of the old-fashioned vinyl recordings, and it's great that they're back in fashion again, because it means I can indulge in that little passion. But when a needle gets stuck in a groove that's got too deep, it'll just go round and round and round and round and round forever until you give it a little nudge. And that's essentially what we're trying to do. We need to nudge ourselves out of the grooves that we've gotten into, these patterns of behavior and ways of thinking. And and the other thing is that people often avoid the things that make them feel anxious. And this again is why it's so important to get outside of our comfort zones, because what we know about the brain and about things like anxiety and depression is that the more you try to avoid the things that make you feel anxious, the more anxious you become. It's almost like you're caught up in your right brain experiencing this feeling of anxiety, and your left brain is stuck telling these really unhelpful stories. And so it keeps you tied up in anxiety. Whereas what we know is that if we approach the situation that makes us feel anxious in a proactive frame of mind, this activates the left prefrontal cortex in ways that can help problem solve the situation and soothe our amygdala, which is the part of our brain that signals that there's a perception of threat. So as an example, procrastinating over assignments. Now, I know many people do this. I've done it myself in the past. So, but essentially what this does, it makes our anxiety worse. The more you procrastinate over your assignments, it just encourages the negative thinking, you know, all the reasons why you feel like you can't do this, it's too hard, you know, I won't get it right, don't really understand what I'm trying to say. The more you get into that negative thinking, the more anxious you become. Whereas the minute that you start it, and even just to create a little bit of a map about how you're going to do it, you should feel that your anxiety levels start to dip. And the more you get into it, the lower your anxiety should become. So that's an example of how when we try to avoid the things that make us feel anxious, it actually just makes us feel worse. So if we kind of put all of this together there, and again, I'm thinking about this from the lens of a counselor, from a therapist's point of view, there are three kind of important networks in our brain that really we need to sort of pay attention to. There's the salience network, the executive network, and what's called the default mode network. So let me just go through those. So the salience network involves somatic sensations. So this is the right side of the brain that I was talking about, the things that feel things, that we feel the world. We sense that we're feeling anxious because of the bodily sensations. And this is called bottom-up processing of information. And oftentimes, you know, and again, to go back to the earthquake, you know, the first thing I was aware of was, you know, there's shaking and this noise, and then this feeling inside of anxiety. So it's a felt sense. The executive network is our prefrontal cortex. So this is the part of our brain that can facilitate focused attention. And we can choose to, if we're mindfully aware, we can start to choose where we want to put our attention. And this is called top-down processing, where and again, the left side of the brain is heavily involved here, because we're trying to make sense of what's happening right now in the moment. And then the final one is the default mode network. And this is where, this part of the brain gets activated when we don't have something specific to focus on. And this is where we tend to start daydreaming and ruminating about things. And also, when we're in this frame of mind, we tend to be operating on automatic pilot. We're not mindfully present in the same way we are when we're in our executive network. Our mind's wandering all over the place. And the focus is usually self-referential. In other words, we're usually thinking about ourselves. We're focused on how we're feeling, and we're often ruminating about the past or worrying about the future, and full of self-judgment. The DMN, the default mode network, is the seat of our inner critic. But it doesn't have to be that way. This network can also be an incredibly creative space where we come up with all kinds of new solutions to problems, and artists spend an awful lot of time in the daydreaming phase, and it can be quite playful. So when we're in this daydreaming or ruminating kind of network, these fantasies can either boost or undermine our self-esteem. And this depends largely on our attachment style and our early history. So if we grew up with an insecure attachment style, that we were never quite sure that people were going to meet our needs, we're always fearful of being abandoned. If we were heavily criticized by our parents or other people in our lives when we were very young, then that's going to influence what happens when we're in that default mode network. When you're left alone to your own thoughts, they can be quite negative. So what can we do about that? Well, there are a few things that we can do. Firstly, I'd suggest the most important thing is to adopt self-compassion, to learn to be more kind to ourselves and not listen to this internal critic. When we're calling ourselves out in mean ways and being really mean to ourselves, we're actually increasing the levels of cortisol that's in our system, which is the involved in the threat response. And too much cortisol in the system is not good for our brains or our bodies. So we need to, and again, we need to be kind to ourselves, talk to ourselves in kind ways and not be mean to ourselves. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we need to start constructing more helpful stories, solution-oriented stories, and stories that are hopeful and helpful, rather than the negative, scary stories that we tell ourselves. So when we think about these three networks, the salience network, the executive network, and the default mode network, they're all really important. And what the neuroscience tells us is that when we balance all three networks, we have optimal mental health. It's what Daniel Siegel calls an integrative mind, where all the networks and all the parts of the brain are all working efficiently. And in therapy, it kind of works a little bit like this. So when we think about the salience network, which is the felt sense, and is often very, when you think about your autonomic nervous system, we can go, if we're triggered by the environment, we can go into a fight, flight, or a freeze response, where we really want to help people to be in a calm frame of mind. When we feel calm, we're much more able to manage our problems and problem solve. So the therapeutic relationship, it plays a big part in in managing our nervous system and our felt experience of the world. So when we have empathy and when we have unconditional positive regard for our clients, we're not judging them and we're allowing them to feel safe. That's really, really helpful at calming down and soothing the system. However, it's not enough. We also need to encourage present-oriented, action-directed, and productive behavior, which is belongs to our executive functioning, our executive network. And this allows us to notice in the moment when we are starting to tell ourselves the scary stories that normally can happen automatically. When we're able to be in the present, we start to notice when we're acting out in ways that are not in our best interest. So being mindfully present, and we can help our clients, and we can all do that for ourselves through all kinds of, meditation, yoga. There's lots of ways that we can learn to be mindfully present. And then finally, the DMN, the default mode network, which really is often the hardest to tackle, because this is the networks where we're telling ourselves these scary stories. Therapy needs to provide new positive narratives so that when we have nothing specific to focus our attention on, when we're not busy, in other words, we don't automatically go to the scary stories. And by the way, just as an aside to that's part of the reason why a lot of people become workaholics, so that they can avoid being in the DMN. And on the opposite extreme, people who aren't busy, who don't have enough to focus on in their lives, can end up being quite depressed because they spend so much time in this daydreaming, kind of ruminating state of mind. So that pretty much kind of sums up what I've got to say today about rewiring the brain. Of course, there's lots and lots of information about this these days. It's a very popular topic, and it's a fascinating area. And I hope that, and I'm free to answer any questions right now. And I think I've got one coming up here right now from Shazi, asking about how does rewiring the brain work in the neurodivergent brain. Really good question. Yes, it can help. Probably needs a little bit more kind of specialist treatment but it is certainly something. I could thoroughly recommend a book by Dr. Gabor Mate, who's written a book called The Scattered Mind. So Gabor Mate is a psychiatrist, I think, by training, but he also has ADHD. So he talks a lot about neurodivergent brains. But yes, it certainly can be helpful. What's this? Was wondering if anxiety brain damage can be reversed. Well, that's a bit of a tricky question to ask. I'm not sure what the brain damage is that you're referring to, but certainly PTSD, which is, can be treated through a lot of these techniques. Yeah. Any other questions? From Brenda, is there anything can be done for nighttime waking and slipping into negative thought states? Yeah, look, I mean, the same kind of principle, you really need to help people to, it's a little bit like going to the gym. When you start to learn how to be mindfully aware and starting to change your stories, you have to practice it every day. If you went to the gym once a week and did all the work with your trainer, but for the rest of the week you didn't do anything, then you're not going to change your muscle structure very much. So it's a little bit of the same kind of thing. You have to find a practice that works for you and do it every day. I find myself catastrophizing a lot during the pandemic. Can we rewire our brains to stop worrying about things that are out of control? Absolutely, yes. Again, same principle for all of these questions. Really is that you have to make a commitment to practicing every day, to some kind of mindfulness practice, and self-compassion practice, and yeah, and find someone to talk to, find a counselor who you feel safe with to talk about these things. But yeah, absolutely, we can change all of those things. I've heard that listening to music can help promote neuroplasticity. Is this true? I don't know what the research is on that, but I can certainly tell you that it was through when I was a teenager, long before I'd ever heard of mindfulness or meditation. I learned how to be mindful through listening to music, because I was focusing. I would say that listening to music helps develop your executive functioning, so your ability to focus. So I don't know if that answers your question. It's certainly good for you, and playing music and listening to music is great for the brain in all kinds of ways, because it acts, especially playing music and playing alongside other people, because you're using lots of different parts of your brain. You're using the fine fingering that is required. Rhythm is another part of the brain that's activated. Playing in time with other people. So playing music is really good for the brain. How long will it take to rewire my brain? Well, that's like how long is a ball of string, you know. It can take as long as, you know, it can take a lifetime, because our brain's always changing. We're always rewiring our brain every time we do something new. To get rid of old habits, you know, that can take time. But there's no specific time limit on this. It depends on a lot of things, really. It depends on past experiences and how much trauma there's been, and if it's more than one trauma, you're having to unpack an awful lot of different things. Is there more I can learn about basic neuroscience? Yeah, for sure. There's lots of information out there. The Bachelor of Counselling here at ACAP, which I teach a unit called Counselling and Neuroscience. So there is a unit that looks at this, but there's lots of books out there. People to look out for. Bessel van der Kolk has a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is a really good starting point, probably, to learn a little bit about the brain. The Body Keeps the Score, I think it's called. But there's lots being written now. I'm sure if you just Google, you'll find a whole string of books and articles that you can read about the brain. Great. Okay, well, we might sort of wrap up here now, and hopefully that has been got you interested in the subject, and go out and check it out, and certainly what I do recommend is go and look at self-compassion. Google self-compassion, you'll find various different people talking about that, and mindfulness. Go and look up, you know, find some app that helps you to be more mindfully present. Good.